Hey guys, I'm AH Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be showing you all about how I made my Ravio cosplay, which you can see the finished pieces next to me on either side over here. This costume has several layers of it being a challenge as well as a bit of a dare in a way. So not to get into too much detail, but my friends and I over at Hyrule Hideout's Discord server, we're working on a project that's coming out at the end of October. And we needed a Ravio to be part of it. And originally I wanted to be able to make a Ravio for the project, but unfortunately my machine shut down and a whole other hullabaloo. But I had all the stuff to make him, so I still wanted to make him and I still want to try to make it as quickly as I could. I challenged myself to make it in a short time frame. And for the most part I met that. It took me under 2 weeks, and that's on and off work of course, so it probably only would have taken me a few days if I had done it all at once. This was also a bit of a waiting project because I'm waiting for some fabric to come in the mail for my Snow White cosplay. So while I wait for that, I work on something else. I teased a little bit about this costume in an earlier video, and there will be more content coming later on with this cosplay as well. So if you'd like to see that, be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And without getting into too many little introduction type things, let's actually get into how I made this cosplay. First thing that I made was the robe, the thing you see right behind me here, that purple thing. And what I did was I went through my closet and I looked for a sweater that I figured would have a very similar shape to what I wanted. This is actually the sweater I used, not because it's purple or anything, because I liked where the shoulders sat. It's very slouched and very relaxed looking. I like the length and I like the size of the sleeve. I just decided I wanted to change around the shape of the neckline. I essentially flattened it out, put it down onto the fabric, and used chalk to trace out what each pattern piece looked like. I repeated that for the front, the back, the sleeves, and then I made my own neckline pattern because I don't need mine to be quite as exaggerated as this one. And don't worry, for those who might be cringing right now, I did add seam allowance to the pieces afterwards. That's kind of a really important step. The fabric that I used for this is actually a jersey knit fabric. It is a polyester base, nothing fancy, pretty inexpensive, but I wanted to use stretch for a few reasons. One, because, well, it's comfortable to wear and stretchy is just quite nice. I can move around in it quite well. And also, weight fluctuation, it's a little snug, it will still stretch a little bit, and I didn't have to work around any closures. I'm lucky that I own a serger, so I was able to serge all these pieces together. Without a serger, this thing might not hold together quite as well, because stretch knits can be quite a challenge sometimes. And this way, none of the stitches get all popped out like they would if I had used my straight stitch machine. This piece was fairly quick to put together and just has a very simple rolled hem at the bottom. All the edges are finished because they're all serged together, which allows me to move around quite freely in this costume. The scarf. This was made with black and blue flannel fabric. Another texture once again, and really soft but actually appropriate for a scarf as well. I decided I wanted my finished scarf to be 120 inches long. And I ended up with about 30 total rectangles with 15 of each color. Once all these squares were figured out, I seamed them all together and pressed them all carefully because again, I want this to be nice and flat with no bumps and trouble and such. It's quite a long scarf. It doesn't touch the floor, which was the goal because I didn't want to have to clean flannel every time I wore this thing. Once that long strip was created, I had to fold it in half and stitch the bottom seam. Once I finished that and pressed it out all nice, which took forever because this is 120 inches of scarf, I had a finished scarf. I finished the edges and the scarf was all done. It was honestly probably the fastest piece of the entire thing, faster even than the robe. The next piece I made was the belt. Now, you might look at this piece and think it looks like a little cincher or something, but it's actually just a straight belt. The pattern is straight up and down. It's around the size of my waist and with the desired shape. There's no fancy fitting seams on here. The brown pieces are a type of upholstery fabric, I believe. It's like a textured dupioni, but it is a nice texture and I really liked it, and I added interfacing to make it a little bit stronger. The red piping that you see is a piping cord that I got from Fabricland, and I really like it as well. It adds, again, a little bit more texture to this costume so it doesn't look totally flat. This was simply piped on using my zipper foot, and I haven't done piping in so long, so this was very satisfying to do. To put the lining onto the back, I actually decided to press all of the seam allowance inwards and then pin it all into place. My reasoning for this is that I wanted to hand stitch on the lining, just so everything would look super, super clean at the end. No needing to worry about top stitching lines or anything like that on the opposite side. Both sides end up looking really clean this way. And it also helps me control that last bit of piping, which I had to fold up underneath the lining. Now, to finish this off as a finished piece, it does need a closure of some kind. Unlike the robe, this is not a stretch piece. But I didn't want to put a zipper and I didn't want to put a Velcro or something like that because that is very limited on sizing, so I decided to put grommets. I didn't film the entire process of the grommeting, but I do have a little bit of the footage of me covering the grommets with red embroidery floss. This adds a little bit of a nice touch to the belt. It makes it look a little less official. It makes it look a little bit more like something that Ravio might actually have. And these grommets allow me to adjust the belt. It looks cool, but it also helps that if I lose or gain weight, I can tighten or loosen the belt. So this makes it a very versatile costume because no matter if I lose or gain weight, I can still fit in it. Now, something of note on the belt is the rupee up on the front. This took a little bit of patterning and math and geometry to do, and was a bit of a pain in the butt. I would highly recommend, if you want to make Ravio, to actually check out 8Z Cosplay's patterns because they have the rupee figured out for you already and how to make it out of EVA foam and the whole thing. So I started to play around with shapes and see if they were what I wanted and glue them together, making it out of thin EVA foam. My first one did not go very well and I did not like it. It was too skinny. It needed to be a bit wider. And then I tried again and I actually liked it a lot better. I wasn't expecting it to work out that quickly. I was expecting at least 3 trial runs. So this one I ended up taking and using, and I used foam clay to fill in the gaps and kind of add a raised edge to kind of give it a little bit more pop and make it look even more 3D. So once all of this was ready to go, I did have to prime it first. I used a black gesso to do so, and then I painted it with acrylics. I like acrylic paints. They're really cheap, they're really easy, and I have a ton of them. I used first a cheaper one for the base coats because it took several coats of paint to do this. And then I used my nice, more fluorescent colored ones for the upper coats. And then same thing with the raised edges. Those I also painted gold, and it also took several different layers, and this time a little bit more concentration because there are a lot finer lines and not big geometric shapes. I wanted to add this little gold edging just to kind of make it pop a little more and to tie in the gold that shows up on the mask because it's just kind of the only area that has any yellow or gold. So I tied it in on the belt by putting it on the rupee and on the cording on the back. And finally, once this was all nicely finished and had a nice glaze coat on it, it was time to add it to the belt, which again was just about lining everything up and finding the exact center to place it. Now we get to the piece I think you're all really wanting to hear about, the bunny hood. I was at a loss on how the heck I would make this thing because headgear and things like this are not my forte, sewing is. Luckily for me, my friend 8Z Cosplay was also making a Ravio cosplay and put out a book about making it. It includes a bunch of patterns and such, like for the hood, for the belt, the rupee on the belt, and also instructions on how to make all the other pieces like the scarf and the robe. I also got to proofread this, so I got to get a look at this book ahead of time, and 8Z Cosplay also did actually give me their patterns, which I'm very, very grateful for. Without them, I would have been at a complete loss on how to do this. To respect 8Z Cosplay and the secrets they reveal in this amazing tutorial book, I am not going to reveal every single little detail on how to make this, because some of that is revealed in the book, and that's kind of like a spoiler, so I don't want to spoil the book for you guys. But it is interesting because when they made theirs, they did not make any of theirs fabric based, it's all EVA foam based. Mine, meanwhile, I took very different steps to create it because I ended up using those fabric layers. So let's talk about what I did. First was the EVA foam base. I traced out the patterns provided by 8Z Cosplay onto 6mm EVA foam, leaving all the notch lines so I knew how to match everything up. King was also very helpful at this stage because apparently EVA foam makes very fun noises and he really wanted to climb underneath it. This is why I can't let him help me with cosplay ever. So, disclaimer here, I am not efficient at gluing foam whatsoever. I am very bad at it because I'm not used to it, but it's also not something that I enjoy as much compared to sewing. So as you can probably see here, I'm a little rickety at it. I'm not very good. I probably don't have the patience I would need for it to do a full armor build or anything. So I was very happy that I was eventually going to fabric cover this thing. To get the shape to sit properly, I did have to use my heat gun and kind of convince the EVA foam to sit into shape, which after a little bit of pushing and heating, it sat pretty nicely and we now have the shape that you're seeing over here next to me. And then I had to line up where the eye holes would go, and that kind of was like carving a pumpkin, honestly, marking a pumpkin before you carve it and then cut in the eyes. This was a step not in 8Z Cosplay's tutorial book because theirs has 3D eyes that stick out off the face, while mine are inset more so. Then I repeated the same with the ears. Each ear has 4 pieces that all curve together, and this was probably the hardest part, trying to convince the foam to curve into these little points at the very top of the ear. This took so much patience, and then I had to do it all over again because there are 2 ears. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt. But I got it. A few hours later, I had 2 semi-solid ears that were ready to go. Now to move on to the fabric parts of this. So I used the same exact patterns meant for the foam, and then I traced that first onto pieces of the fabric. Now the difference here was I was not tracing every single notch, but I was tracing the entire piece, and then I was treating some of the gaps between seams originally meant for EVA foam as darts instead. So I was leaving them there so I'd eventually sew that together and you'd have this little extra flap of fabric. So that's why you see me leaving these gaps there and not removing these gaps at all. I also did add seam allowance down that center seam that eventually ends up being the center of the mask. Because otherwise, how am I going to sew this thing together without some seam allowance? To sew this, those former seams became darts. Essentially what I traced out was what I sewed along and created darts with. Because this piece would not be stretched like crazy, I was not worried about any seams popping or anything like that. Because it's not like I'm stretching it over a pair of shoulders or anything. Once it's on the mask, it is staying there. And this fit like a perfect shell eventually. So I sewed these as darts and then I clipped out some of that excess bulk that would have been created if I have left it all there, pressed it open, and I had a nice flat dart and a nice round shape. Before I could sew both of my halves together, I did also have to add on some applique because he does have those really nice little eyeliner eyes there. For this, I did use the pattern provided and traced out the shape onto fabric first. I had to find the exact placement again and then place that little piece of yellow fabric onto the purple. And then using my machine, I used a tight zigzag stitch and went around to create an applique to keep that eye in place. And then I had a purple hood with yellow eyes. And that's where that was at that point. Once the eyes were all appliqued into place, I did sew that center seam together to now have the full fabric form of the hood. Next, it was actually attaching this thing to the foam shape. My beach ball was ready to get adorned. And then I took that seam allowance that I added to the bottom of this of the fabric pieces, and I used this to kind of tuck and glue the fabric to the inside of the mask, which you can see me doing here. I'm slowly but surely pulling the fabric around the shape, setting it into place and keeping it in place on the foam base. It looks a little messy now, but it does get cleaned up later, don't worry. The glue I'm using here is called Fabric Tack, and I use an awful lot of it here, but it does do wonders at gluing fabric things to other things. Now that those were in place, it was time to finish off those eyes. They're not exactly supposed to be solid yellow, and by putting that yellow on, you couldn't see through the holes that I had already punched in there, so they became kind of pointless. So it was time to punch holes into them. I cut little lines into the eye hole, and then I push and pull them into the inside of the mask. This creates a very nice finished edge on the outside of the mask, and with some very careful gluing, it ended up looking really, really nice. And the inside of the mask ends up having like a star shape on the inside of it. And then it was time to actually give the whole thing some eyes, because I need something to cover up the eye holes, and he does have these giant blue cartoony eyes on his mask. For this, I use something that is usually used for cross stitch. It is a plastic netting of some type. I'm not sure the exact name of it, but I got it for like $2 at Michael's. I figured out the shape that I needed and I painted over it. I had to paint it very, very lightly because I didn't want to fill in all the little gaps, because that's kind of the point. I need those gaps in order to see out of this mask. But it's super easy to paint and it was really convenient. So thank you to my fursuiter friends for suggesting this, because this is actually a method that many fursuiters use on their masks, which is very clever. Once it was all dry and both the blue and the black were in place, I was able to place the eyes into the mask. And I was actually really impressed by how well I could see through the mask at this point, because I was kind of worried that my vision would be very limited, but this stuff is great for masks. Oh my gosh. And then after the eyes were in place, it was time to add in the trim. The trim at the bottom, I used the pattern to figure out the initial curve on the very front there, and then the rest is just a straight line, because I knew that because my yellow fabric was a stretch, I'd be able to kind of just stretch it around. I just sewed the center front seam, and then it was time to do a lot of hand stitching. I like to do this by hand stitching because it creates a very nice clean finish once again, and it's just satisfying to do, and I have a lot of control. That, and it was already on the EVA foam base and glued into place, so I couldn't exactly run this through my sewing machine to top stitch it. And when I was done with that, I took the excess of the yellow and tucked it up on the inside of the mask. This hides and cleans up that area that was a little rough before when I glued in the purple fabric. And then it was time to kind of repeat the same process with the ears, which was essentially the same exact thing. I added seam allowance to the EVA foam patterns, sewed them together, made sure the seam allowance was nice and flat, and then put them onto the EVA foam ears and used fabric tack to glue the excess fabric onto the inside. I'm not going to share everything about how I attach the ears, but I will let you know that they are removable. With this pattern and the methods that 8Z Cosplay uses, the ears are removable, which is why I see a bit of a seam here. But it's so convenient because I can take them off and I can store this easier, travel with it easier. I don't have this piece being almost 2 feet tall. And then I just had to glue the teeth to the very front and my mask was done. And suddenly I was finished the entire costume as well. I will have to say though, the mask was definitely the hardest part of the entire costume. It took the longest, and I think it actually took longer than the entire rest of the costume combined. But that's also because I wanted to make sure I did it well, because this is the most out of my comfort zone I was in the entire costume make. And I really enjoyed it, and I think I'm gonna have a lot of fun wearing this around to cons, for photo shoots, and all sorts of other shenanigans. I could not have achieved this entire cosplay without 8Z Cosplay's help, and I really, really appreciate the help that she gave me. Her patterns are amazing quality. I've mentioned in another video before, and I highly recommend checking out all 3 of her books, because there's 3 now, because they're absolutely incredible and really, really helpful. In the end, I'm very proud of this cosplay, and I hope you guys enjoyed kind of watching and listening to me walk you through how I made this. Please stay tuned for more Ravio content, because there is some coming, I can promise you that. Thank you guys so much for watching and coming on this little adventure with me on how I made my Ravio cosplay, and be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. See you guys later.